Hello, hope you're doing okay and your revision's going well, if that's where you are. So today I want to take you through a dialogues. So we're going to look at a question. It's an ethics question because I think these tend to be the ones that people find perhaps a little bit more tricky with choosing what to refer to than maybe the philosophy ones. So we're going to take a question, break it down, think about how to make some links, and talk a bit about choosing your material, because it's never going to be possible to include everything, but you want to make sure that you're including the right sorts of things that are going to get you plenty of marks. So let's get into it. So the one I've chosen is going all the way back to 2018, and it's quite a nice, clear-cut one, bringing together some of the Christianity material with some year one ethics. So in this case, it's natural moral law. So Christian attitudes to animals are consistent with the views of natural moral law. Now, your command words, this bit here, will always be very, very similar. It will always start with critically examine and evaluate this claim with reference to the dialogue between Christianity. And then it may just say ethics, or it may just say ethical studies. In this case, it says Christianity and natural moral law. So it specifically wants you to keep the focus on natural moral law, and that's worth bearing in mind as we go through. Now, as you probably know, the 25 marks is broken down into 10 marks for AO1, 15 marks for AO2. So the way that the examiner will mark this is they will read the whole of the answer. They will then give it a mark out of 10 for knowledge and understanding, which is AO1, and they will give it a mark out of 15 for AO2, which is evaluation. So those two skills can absolutely be combined together in how you write it. You don't need to separate out the AO1 and the AO2. You can if you want to. I personally wouldn't, because I think that can become a little bit unnatural. But and I'll say more about this in a little bit, AQA don't have a specific formula for answering these that they're looking for. They want to see what you do with it, which gives you, in many ways, quite a lot of freedom. So that's a good thing. So let's start planning this then. So what I would do first of all is think about my question. What are Christian attitudes to animals, and how do I know this, and what is there in the specification that's going to help me? So I think your main go-to for Christian attitudes to animals is going to be that good conduct and key moral principles topic in year one Christianity. And particularly within that, you've got ideas about stewardship and dominion. So that's all about caring for the environment, respecting non-human forms of life. We can also put in some general Christian beliefs that come up throughout the course, really, about the status and value of God's creation. So if everything that is a living thing is a creation of God, that gives it perhaps an inherent value. Not perhaps quite the same as a human life, but it doesn't mean that it has no value at all. It has, it has value to God. And then we can also go to situation ethics, because even though that's in the ethics part of the specification, it's a Christian ethical theory. So it is going to inform some Christian attitudes to animals. Now, obviously, not every Christian follows situation ethics, but pretty much everybody who follows situation ethics is Christian, because it's grounded in that Christian principle of agape. So we can go there too. We're not going to let that dominate the essay, because the essay is asking for a dialogue between Christianity and natural moral law. But I think it's absolutely okay to make that one of the Christian points of view that you refer to. Now, looking at natural moral law, we get, even though natural moral law is clearly a Christian ethical theory, Aquinas was a Christian, his views on animals are not necessarily in step with what Christians would say today. And that's why this is actually a good question, and it gives you quite a lot to talk about. Aquinas' starting point tends to be Aristotle's hierarchy of souls. So that places humans right at the top, then animals, then plants. And the thinking is that if you are above something in that hierarchy, then you have the freedom to use it. So what makes humans different from animals in that hierarchy of souls is that humans have rationality and animals don't. This has got quite big implications for how Aquinas sees animals. So he thinks they exist for human use. There's no problem with humans using animals. And he goes further. There's a moment in the Summa Theologica where he refers to animals as property. So he sees them as more similar to things than to people. That's an area where I think we can straight away say, well, there's going to be disagreement between that and Christianity today. And that isn't necessarily Aquinas' fault, because we're going back many centuries. He didn't know what we know now about things like animals having fully functioning central nervous systems and feeling pain in the same way that people feel pain. He only seems to consider cruelty to animals a problem if it leads to cruelty to humans, because that would undermine living in an ordered society, which would violate a primary precept. Many Christians today would say, yes, but let's do better than that. Let's recognise that cruelty to animals is a problem in itself and not just a problem that might lead to cruelty to humans. It's much more of an idea in Christianity today that animals matter in their own right. They don't just matter as a means to an end for humans. And then, very important to note in natural moral law, the primary precept to preserve innocent life, Aquinas means innocent human life. That doesn't apply to animals. Quite often I've read essays where people have started to talk about natural moral law and animals, and they're saying things like, animals must be protected because animals are innocent and you have to preserve innocent life. No, it doesn't work like that, because that precept to preserve innocent human life, he really does only mean humans. He's not thinking of animals in the same way. So I've already said a little bit of this, but let's unpack it, because this is going to help to give you some of your AO2 content as well as your AO1. So if animals are creations of God, this suggests that God's created them with a purpose, with a telos. Now that's straight out of Aquinas' thinking, which again he borrowed a little bit from Aristotle, the idea of everything having a function. If they're used purely as a means to an end for human use, how can they fulfill this? So, for example, if a chicken who is intensively farmed spends its entire life in a cage in a space the size of a piece of A4 paper, it doesn't ever really get to be a chicken. All it ever is going to be is an end product for Nando's. So this is the idea that, you know, certain things can't be acceptable to Christians if animals are creations of God. It doesn't mean that you can't ever eat the chicken, but it does mean that, you know, it has to have a chance to actually be a chicken first, because God has created it to be a chicken. That's just an example. I'm sure you can think of others. Second point, many Christians feel that animal suffering is worthy of moral consideration. That's largely because we now know much more, that animals are far more like humans than probably would have been believed in Aquinas' time. To Aquinas, something like a donkey or an ox, he would have seen that as utterly different than a human being. But we don't in quite the same way, because we understand that physiologically there are a lot of similarities. And also, if the animals can feel pain, which we know they can, that means that they are worthy of moral consideration. We have to factor in that pain to our ethical decisions. Most Christians would disagree that animals only have the status of property. Aquinas thinks they do. Thinking has moved on there. So Aquinas' thinking is perhaps a little bit outdated there. And a greater emphasis on stewardship in Christian thinking, which has come along in the last particularly kind of 50 to 100 years, now that it's become apparent that the planet's in a bit of trouble, that rejects Aquinas's argument that animals exist primarily for our use. It's that exploitative approach that Aquinas seems to be on board with that has actually contributed a lot to climate change, to global warming, to some of the environmental problems we're now chasing. So Christians today, many feel that it's time that something was done about that attitudes change. It's happening slowly, but it is happening. Other Christian ethical perspectives that you can use. We've mentioned situation ethics. Now that includes animals in agapeic calculations. So that's what I mean by taking into account that animals feel pain, that animals need to be loved. Maybe not quite to the extent of humans, but for many Christians, they'd be more comfortable with that than just assuming that animals don't really matter, that animals are more like things. We can also look at the example of Jesus. Now, there's not too much about Jesus's attitude to animals, but he acted with kindness, he was gentle, he was compassionate to everyone. And many Christians argue that if you're trying to follow the example of Jesus, you can't really switch those virtues on when you're dealing with people and then switch them off when you're dealing with animals. If you're kind, gentle, and compassionate, then you kind of need to be kind, gentle, and compassionate in everything you do, not just when you're dealing with people. And then in Good Conduct, Key Moral Principles, when it talks about stewardship, we've got a little bit on the development of eco-theology, which is a relatively modern Christian view that all creation is interconnected. And actually, we are one big creation, we are one big ecosystem. So that's rejecting the very human-centered, anthropocentric, which just means human-centered, view that Aquinas seems to have had. So examples you can use. Now, to get AO1 marks, I would always put in examples from the spec. They are crucial to help you get marks. If you don't put in any examples, you run the risk that your AO1 content is going to be very vague, and it's going to be hard for the examiner to really see that you know what you're talking about. So I've put some examples here. So you could talk about meat eating versus intensive farming. Meat eating in Christianity is historically not that controversial. Many Christians are vegetarian, but also many aren't, because there's no prohibition against eating meat in the Bible. It's something that historically Christians have always done. But we can contrast that with intensive farming. So Aquinas says using animals is fine, and he's getting that from the idea of the hierarchy of souls. But intensive farming is exploitative. It's very often cruel. Its motivation is profit and productivity. It's therefore disapproved of by many Christians. And we can't ask Aquinas what he would think of it, but it's fair to say that it's a very different method of producing animals for meat than he would have been familiar with. Animal cloning, we could talk about this. Now, Aquinas, through natural moral law, may have rejected it because he could have seen it as a failure to worship God. If you mess with the natural order of things by cloning an animal or by changing the genetic makeup of an animal, he may have seen that as very problematic because you're essentially playing God. But animal cloning is a thing today, and the Catholic Church has approved some uses of it. So increasing milk yield so that more people can be fed, because milk is obviously a staple in many cultures, and reducing disease in animals. So that overall, the idea behind that is to reduce animal suffering. And then blood sports. This is one that I would do as well. Aquinas seems to think that, he doesn't directly address blood sports, but he seems to think that cruelty to animals only matters if it then led on to cruelty to humans. But most Christians would struggle to see that there's any genuine goodness in blood sports. There's also nothing in the primary precepts that says that it's important for us to be entertained. So saying that it's entertaining and therefore it's okay, that doesn't really wash, because there are ways to entertain yourself that don't require cruelty to animals. So many Christians can't find really a very good defendable argument there anymore. So how to structure the essay? I think people do tend to overthink dialogues. There aren't any fixed rules. AQA don't prefer any particular structure. All you have to do is make sure that there's AO1 content and AO2 content. How you put that together is entirely up to you. The best way I've ever found to do it, that my students have found pretty successful, is write it as if you're essentially doing an AO2 answer, but you explain yourself a little bit more along the way. That's probably the best approach that I've found. And I've been teaching this spec for as long as it's existed. So in a paragraph then, you might have a little bit of AO1 content where you explain what you're talking about, and then you might further in that paragraph, or perhaps in a later paragraph, you'll do some analysis of what you've just said. So that way you're hitting AO1 and AO2. I'm not personally a huge fan of introductions. I'm not saying don't do one, because if you want to do one, that's fine, but make sure it's actually saying something. Make sure it's contributing something useful to the essay. Otherwise, you're just saying the question again in more words, and you're not going to get any marks for that. We need a balance of knowledge and critical analysis. So bear in mind that knowledge is 10 marks, critical analysis is 15. So possibly tip the quantity of AO2 a little bit more than AO1. And because we are being assessed on AO2 in this question, you definitely need a conclusion. This is where you present your strongest overall argument. It's where you answer the question and justify that by referring back, if you need to things that you've already said. Danger with a conclusion, though, is that you just repeat a previous paragraph. Try not to do that. So this is why I would say, whatever you think your strongest overall point is, save that for the end and build your conclusion around it. That can work well. So finally, I've laid out a little bit of a plan here for some AO2 arguments. So thinking back to the question, it's asking whether you think Christian attitudes to animals are consistent with natural moral law. So the left-hand column is arguments that they are consistent, and the right-hand column is arguing that they aren't. So this is going to give you your arguments. So on the one hand, both Aquinas and mainstream Christianity accept meat eating. It's not hugely ethically problematic. But Christians reject intensive farming on the grounds that it exploits animals. Aquinas might not have had the same view, given what he says about animals being for the use of humans. Secondly, Aquinas sees animals as having very little moral status, and that does tend to come through in Genesis as well, because God gives control of animals to humankind. There's a quote which I think says, "Everything that moves and lives will be food for you." But knowing what we know now about how animals operate, how they suffer, it's hard for modern Christians to defend the view that they are more similar to things, which is what Aquinas says. Thirdly, the precept of preserving innocent life applies to humans but not animals. And the sanctity of life principle in Christianity is very similar. That's about humans being created imago Dei and therefore having that inherent value. Now, animal life may not be imago Dei, but animals are still part of God's creation. That's the eco-theology argument. And they therefore deserve moral consideration. They matter. They have to be factored into ethical decisions. And then finally, procedures such as cloning, animal testing, organ transplants, they could be justified by natural moral law. They could be justified by Christianity if they save human lives. That's true and not hugely controversial. But I think the flip side of that is not at any cost. So this is where I'd use a bit of Fletcher. and say that pragmatism's important, saving lives is important because it's agapeic, it's doing what works to bring about a loving result, but not at any cost. Excessive cruelty, exploitation of animals, that isn't okay. That isn't loving. So you have to factor in how to get a balance right there. Okay, so that's just a quick 20-minute blast on ethics dialogues. Hope that's been helpful. As we get closer to the exams, I'll try and find time to make some more videos. Anything that you'd particularly like to see that I haven't covered, leave me a comment and I'll do my best to put it together for you. Work hard and I'll see you next time.